the participants, all those of you who have logged in. Welcome to the 40th webinar of Anekdhara. Today's theme is Putting Patients Above Profits, Unshackling Regulation of Private Healthcare in India. For those of you who are familiar with Tamil films, in 2002, there was a Tamil film called Ramana, in which there was a vigilant hero who takes a certified dead body to a private hospital, where after several hours of treatment, they charge the family several lakh of rupees. From that is in the real life. In the real life, also in 2018, we've heard of a case in a hospital, private hospital in Tanjavur, where the hospital treated a dead person, a deceased person, for 3 days, and then charged the family 5 lakhs, and then demanded an additional 3 lakhs. Even if one excludes these extreme cases, billing in private hospitals, often on things like diagnostics, surgical procedures, even visits by specialists as there are inpatients. We often read these in the newspaper reports. They are often highly inflated, and hospitals resort to criminal extortion. They don't release the bodies of the deceased and so on and so forth. These reports we often get from the newspaper reports. And this is practiced across India, including corporate hospitals in NCR and others. So, private healthcare system, where nearly 70% of our households turn to for their medical treatment, is plagued with savage money spinning procedures. On the one hand, the public health system is woefully short of capacity and quality and tends to rob patients of their dignity. Our private healthcare system just robs patients. In an inclusive and insightful book titled, this is on the India's healthcare system, Do We Care? Ms. K. Sujata Rao, a former civil servant, highlights how increasing financialization has distorted our health priorities. Private clinics and hospitals care more about the shareholders' interests than health outcomes of the patients. Worse still, she talks about how the state policy or the public policy is skewed in favor of private healthcare to the extent that district hospitals have been handed over to corporate hospitals. There are cases of such things happening in Bhuj, Gujarat, and Chittor in Andhra Pradesh. Coming to regulation, there was this act, I think Dr. Shukla, who was our speaker, will explain, called the Clinical Establishment Act in 2010, and rules were framed in 2012 for which enable the government to kind of limit the charges which a hospital can charge. But precious little has happened, and the regulation which is supposed to be in place is yet not perceptible really. So civil society has been engaged in a struggle against inadequacy and inequity in our healthcare. In 2021, through a public interest litigation by Swasthya Abhiyan, the court was implored to enforce standardized fee structure under the rules of 2012 to tackle overcharging. The court mandated that the union government propose uniform hospital charges to address disparities between government rates and private rates. The struggle is ongoing. The best part of today's webinar is we have with us the prime crusader against all that is wrong with our healthcare system in India. And he will speak to us on today's theme, putting patients above profits, unshackling regulation of private healthcare. I now have the privilege of introducing Dr. Abhay Shukla, our speaker for the day. Dr. Abhay Shukla is a public health physician working on community and public health issues in Maharashtra since last 3 decades. He is a senior scientist at Sathi, Pune, national co-convener of Swasthya Abhiyan, which was, I mentioned, was engaged in this PIL. Member of the core group on National Human Rights Commission. and Global Steering Committee member of the People's Health Movement. He's one of the founders of the National Network Alliance of Doctors for Ethical Healthcare. Dr. Shukla has been centrally involved in developing the framework of rights-based community monitoring and planning of healthcare services in India. He has since 2007 mentored two key processes in more than thousand villages in Maharashtra. The process for public health system accountability, helping people to reclaim and majorly improve health service delivery, and B, the development of community action for nutrition CAN processes, which have led to significant positive impacts and substantially reduced malnutrition. Dr. Shukla led the drafting of the National Patients' Rights Charter adopted by NHRC and the Union Health Ministry. He has authored and co-authored various publications on the health system in India, including Dissenting Diagnosis, published by Penguin, which exposes malpractices in the private medical sector in India. Other books include Review of Healthcare in India, Report on Health Equities in Maharashtra, Health System in India, Crisis and Alternatives. He was involved in preparing India's national health draft of the India's National Health Bill 2009, has played an advisory role for Rajasthan government's pioneering right to health legislation during 2019-20. He was also a member of Tamil Nadu government's advisory committee for drafting a right to health policy for the state. Dr. Shukla has facilitated large-scale audit of private hospital bills of COVID patients, leading to unprecedented refund of overcharged amounts by private hospitals to patients. He is the global convener of the International Coalition, COPASA, Community of Practice for Accountability and Social Action on Health, and represents the Indian region in the People's Health Movement Global Steering Committee. He is actively involved in campaigns for right to healthcare, accountability of public health services, and social regulation of private healthcare. So, friends, we have with us just the person who can tell us about the experience, the possibilities, and what we can hope for in a bleak situation where the private healthcare seems to be a marauder, extorting hapless patients and driving people into poverty. Before I hand over the thing to our speaker, I would request all our participants to post your questions on the YouTube chat box. And after our honorable speaker finishes his address, we will take them up and field them. Over to you, sir. Dr. Abhay Shukla.
Thanks a lot, Madhuji, for the detailed introduction. And actually, I must confess that you have already said quite a few things which I was going to say. So, but anyway, I suppose that still I'll add some points. And it will be great if whoever has joined in on the YouTube channel can definitely ask questions later on if they're interested. So can you see the presentation now?
Yes, sir. You can make it full screen.
Yeah. Can you see it now, full screen?
Yes, yes, sir. It's good.
Okay, great. So, yeah, so thanks a lot to the Anekdhara team and to all of you who have joined. And so, yeah, as Madhuji has already said, I will be talking about a very important topic, which is there are 1,000 stories about this. Every household practically in this country has a story about their own experience or someone else whom they know, their experience in a private hospital, but no policy effectively. So thousands or perhaps millions of stories and no effective policy and no effective regulation it's a big paradox. So let us see how this whole situation has unfolded. So first of all, I'd like to ask all of you a question. What is your opinion? Our government, particularly the central government, is it active in implementing various laws? So at least many of us will be knowing about various laws like the UAPA, Anti-Sedition Law, Public Security Act. Those of us who work in NGOs or who are, who know about NGOs, know about FCRA. All of these laws are being implemented not only when they're required, but perhaps even when they're not really required on a very large scale.
Yes.
So our government is very alert in implementing certain laws. But there is one law which is extremely important, and it's a law which is passed by Parliament, which deals with a very, very important subject. It's a life and death subject, actually. The rules for this law have also been passed 13 years back. The law was passed 15 years back. The rules have been passed 13 years back. And this law has actually been adopted by 12 major states across the country, which are almost half of the country's population is covered by this law today, at least in theory. But this law is yet to be implemented. So now this is a big question. I mean, our government is so hyperactive in implementing certain laws. What has happened to this law? Despite the fact that if this law were implemented today, it would provide huge relief to hundreds of millions of people. And this law, now in 2025, we will be celebrating 15 years of non-implementation of this very important law. Now, I think you already know which law we are talking about. This is the Clinical Establishments Act 2010. This was passed in August 2010 by the Parliament of this country after a lot of debate and discussion. And this law basically, after that in 2012, the rules were passed. And the purpose of this act and the rules is to regulate private hospitals particularly. And of course, states have an option whether they want to adopt this act or they want to adopt some or similar state level regulation. So 12 states, including the entire list which you can see here, and many of these are large states like Assam, Bihar, Haryana, Rajasthan, Telangana, UP, Jharkhand, Himachal. These have all adapted this act. So you can say almost half of the population of this country is covered by this act. But there's a small hitch. And despite the act and the rules being in place, there is something called minimum standards, which means that if any hospital or nursing home or laboratory is to be registered under the act, they have to fulfill certain standards. Now, these minimum standards are essential to complete the process of regulation. And without the minimum standards, you cannot actually regulate any hospital or any healthcare establishment effectively because they are not fulfilling what is required. Now, these minimum standards were supposed to be notified legally by 2014, within 2 years of adoption of the rules. Rules were adopted in 2012. Standards were supposed to be legally required to be notified by 2014. During 2013-14, the process of formulation of these standards started. On behalf of Jan Swasthya Abhiyan, some of us also contributed to this because it was a very important process. We had one or two members in some of the committees. But after 2014, something strange happened. We don't understand what exactly happened. But suddenly, whatever momentum was there to formulate the standards and take the next step to implementation of the act, that completely decelerated. And that's why I've called it the long tail or the long tail. That tail, वो हनुमान जी की दुम की तरह वो लंबा होता ही चला गया. And the tail is not ending. It's an unending tail. And till today, 30th of March 2025, these minimum standards have not been notified. I don't think there's probably any other example in recent Indian history where a major law has remained completely unimplemented just because of this kind of a administrative or whatever you want to call it, delay of more than a decade. What are the reasons for this delay? Obviously, there is some reason. So as far as we understand, there is resistance by certain sections of the private medical sector. Mind you, I'm not saying doctors. I'm saying private medical sector, particularly certain, commercial private hospitals and what we can call the commercial medical lobby. For whatever reasons, they do not want any kind of regulation of their business practices, of their treatment practices, or the ways in which their private hospitals function. And combined with this, there has been very weak political will, especially after 2014. Until 2014, from 10 to 14, basically, at least there was some forward movement, even though there was some, you can say, resistance, but the government was overcoming that resistance. But after 2014, it seems that this pressure from the private hospital lobby has become, much more influential. And also, unfortunately, we have not had enough demand from the general public and from consumers for implementation of this very important act. So I'll come to this very soon about what needs to be done. But this situation definitely needs to change. And since now we're completing 15 years of this important act, now is the time that this act is converted into action, from act to action on the ground. And of course, you must be thinking, why is the government not regulating private healthcare? So these are some facts which you might be knowing. Electoral bonds. If you see the details, some of the largest purchasers of electoral bonds, and you know which party got the maximum number of payments through electoral bonds. So pharma companies and healthcare firms were among the largest in the country. So now it doesn't require a huge amount of imagination to understand that what is going on. So there's a huge lobby which is very powerful and it's very rich also. I'll just tell you a small fact here that this is a study done, an analysis done by Oxfam India of the top billionaires, the top dollar billionaires in the country in 2022. And which industry is giving how many dollar billionaires? India has the third largest number of dollar billionaires in the world. Third largest after US and China. We have more dollar billionaires than UK or Russia or Japan or France or Brazil or any other of these countries. And among these dollar billionaires, the largest number of billionaires came from the pharma and healthcare sector in 2022, even more than the manufacturing sector, even more than infrastructure, even more than the IT sector. Huge. So now you can start beginning to understand. This is the untold story, which is not, it doesn't make the headlines. But it's such an important story. So this is what is going on. And then linked with this, what is happening because the CE has not been implemented in the last 15 years. Every year, more than 6 crore people, more than 60 million people are pushed below the poverty line in India because they cannot pay hospital expenses, because the hospital expenses are not regulated. So calculate what will be the number over the last 15 years. It will be something like the entire population of India. Or it'll be a huge number. So a huge number of people are being pushed into poverty every year. And if this had been implemented, then with transparency of rates, standardization of quality of care, and stopping of arbitrary overcharging, crores of people would have been benefited. Tens of crores of people would have been benefited. And with standard treatment protocols in place, which is part of the rules, over medication, unnecessary operations, unnecessary investigations, which are unfortunately extremely common. I'll come to that point a little further. All this could have been significantly checked. So how much wastage could have been stopped? And hospitals could have continued to operate with a good income, but not making super profits, and patients would have been hugely benefited. All this has not happened because the dog did not bark. As you know, in Sherlock Holmes story, there's a dog which does not bark. And when the dog does not bark, Sherlock Holmes is extremely surprised. So this is the dog which did not bark for 15 years, and these are the consequences. But along with that, there's one other secret. So just like this, the non-implementation of this law is not something which is widely talked about, definitely not by the government. There's another important secret, which is regarding people's entitlements in private hospitals. So can you guess what is this entitlement? I'm not talking about the CA right now. I'm talking about something else, which is a little different from the CA. So, okay, I'll put this question in a different way. Do patients have rights when they seek care in a private hospital? Think about this. So when we talk about rights, we usually think about government systems, which is correct, of course. People very much do have and must have rights in public systems. But do we have rights in a private hospital? So most people, when they climb the stairs of a private hospital, they forget about rights, or they don't think about rights at all. Even well-educated people who are otherwise quite articulate and vocal on other issues, when they enter a private hospital, they feel, abhi yahan to hum kuch nahi bol sakte. And you're genuinely so vulnerable in a hospital setting that it's difficult to even think about this. But the point is that we have 20 rights in a private hospital. And these have been recognized by the Union Health Ministry of this country. And they have been circulated to the entire, to all states in this country for implementation. That's why I'm calling this as a best kept secret. Have you ever seen a single advertisement about these patients' rights? Have you ever seen a single TV ad? Or, you get so many notifications on your mobile through WhatsApp. When you pick up the phone, you get a recorded message. Have you ever heard these patients' rights being publicized? And these are very important rights. What are these rights? There's the right to information about what illness you have, what care is going to be given, and at least briefly, what are the costs that are involved. Every hospital needs to display the rates that they charge, at least the main indicative rates. Any patient has the right to their records and reports. If I have an ultrasound or a CT scan or an X-ray or a blood test done, that's my actually entitlement. I should get it without any preconditions. There are no preconditions involved. I have not only those, even my case papers, even my indoor papers, I have a right to get a copy of those. Right to informed consent, right to confidentiality, human dignity and privacy, right to non-discrimination on any basis, whether it is religion or caste or language or gender or any other basis or HIV status. There should be no discrimination during healthcare. And it's also very important that we have the right to care according to prescribed rates, wherever such rates are applicable. And as we know, during COVID, such rates were implemented in 15 states across the country. So wherever there is some standardization of rates, that must be, patients have a right to get care at those rates. We have the right to choose where we want to buy our medicines from. In a private hospital nowadays, often this happens, and we have done some studies on this, that you're given a long list of medicines to buy and you're told, buy it from our pharmacy, from the hospital's pharmacy. And you go to the pharmacy and you find out that the medicines are really expensive. And actually, even the MRP printed is very high, but you have no control over that. And you are more or less forced to buy medicines, including anti-cancer medicines, expensive antibiotics, higher-end medicines from the hospital's pharmacy, which are often 1.5 times or maybe even 2 times more expensive than a similar quality, same medicine bought from outside. So actually, you have a right to choose where you want to buy your medicine from and where you want to get your tests done from. Similarly, there's a right to referral and transfer, right to protection during clinical trials, right to take discharge of a live patient or receive the body of a dead patient from the hospital. No hospital has the right to detain the dead body of a patient, even for 1 minute. That's illegal. And this is part of the Patients' Rights Charter. So why is this charter not being communicated? It's a big question mark. And this also tells us what we can do. So what we have done is we have brought out a series of posters in Hindi, in English, and Marathi on these patients' rights. And these are available. If you're interested, I can share them. And the entire series of patients' rights are available in a poster series form. These are all the government's endorsed patients' rights. We are not talking about some theoretical rights. And these are applicable across the country. So, I'm just giving a few examples and few samples of these patients' rights. And now what we found is that these patients' rights were not being implemented. And this was the background to after which basically they started getting implemented. And therefore, in August 2021, the ministry actually circulated this, patients' rights charter with 20 patients' rights. But so far, these have remained probably on the computers of the chief secretaries of different states. We have hardly seen these being displayed or implemented in either public hospitals or private hospitals. So this has been the situation. Now, another question is, as I said, that some private healthcare lobbies are opposing, the implementation of Clinical Establishments Act. So is this true of all doctors? No. There is a significant section, even among medical professionals, which is deeply concerned about corporatization of healthcare and its impacts not only on patients, but also on doctors. And as a medical doctor who has many friends and colleagues in the healthcare profession, I can tell you that we have been discussing these issues quite seriously. And recently, more than 100 doctors and healthcare professionals have signed a testimonial, which is now being submitted to the Supreme Court, which says that we need regulation of private healthcare in this country. And some of these are very senior medical professionals and healthcare professionals, and they are also seeing that uh, the consequences of lack of regulation. Because of lack of regulation of healthcare, the prices are being artificially inflated, and these artificially inflated prices are leading to a situation of extreme market distortion. And with these market distortions, ethical healthcare providers also are suffering. Because, if I am charging a normal fee and I don't give any commissions or cuts, I'll get some patients. Another hospital is charging 3 times higher the fee and it's giving large scale cuts and commissions. All the patients will start getting referred there, even though the care is much more expensive and perhaps less rational. So ethical healthcare practitioners are also being pushed to the margin. Small nursing homes, doctor-run small hospitals are actually being pushed out of the market in this situation. So it's a very dangerous and very a situation which is alarming. And even doctors are now, at least a section of doctors is waking up to this. I talked about unnecessary procedures. So I'll just give you one example. There are many, many examples. Now, these are the recent most figures about what percentage of mothers during delivery they get a cesarean section in our country. Now, if you look at the poorest 20%, only about 7% deliver by cesarean section. The poor middle is about 15%. Middle is about 24%. Middle rich is about 30%. And the richest 20% of the population, the women, 40% of women undergo a cesarean section. Now, the medical need is the highest among the poorest women because they are undernourished, they have low birth weights, they have other more complications. So actually, some of these women are probably dying in labor because they don't get a cesarean section in time. The WHO's norm for a cesarean section is about 10 to 15% on the whole. So we are having, and what is the difference between public hospitals and private hospitals? So in public hospitals, the cesarean section rate is 14%, and in private hospitals, it's 48% nearly. And the same profile are probably poorer women who require more cesarean sections are going to the public hospitals. But the cesarean section rate is, almost 2.5 times higher in private hospitals. So a huge number, roughly 2/3 of the cesarean sections being done in private hospitals in this country are completely unnecessary from any clinical viewpoint. But they're going on day in and day out, and you must be knowing of such stories. So this is just one example. We have many other examples of unnecessary angioplasties, unnecessary, CT scans and various other higher antibiotics and other medications being given, which I don't have the time, but we can discuss that later. But the point is, today in this country, whose interests actually should prevail in the healthcare sector? So we have about 45,000 private hospitals. Okay, it's a large number. It's 45,000. And we have 140 crore people, roughly. अब आप देखिए बैलेंस किस तरफ है. Which scale is outweighing the other scale? So the 45,000 private hospitals are outweighing the interests of 140 crore people until now. And the failure of the government to implement CEA over the last 15 years and the failure to publicize the Patients' Rights Charter, especially over the last 4 years at least, and more than that, is a stark and glaring example of this. So do we need to correct this balance or not? So nobody is saying that private hospitals should shut down or they should not make a reasonable income. But the point is that with lack of regulation, the whole picture has been completely skewed in the direction of profiteering. So therefore, Jan Swasthya Abhiyan, as Madhuji just pointed out, has filed to change this situation. Something needs to be done. And Jan Swasthya Abhiyan has filed a PIL in the Supreme Court of India asking for effective regulation of private hospitals. And there are two key pleas. One is basically that the Clinical Establishments Act should be immediately implemented with the notification of the minimum standards and transparency of rates, standardization of rates, and standard treatment protocols, which are all part of the CA rules must be implemented. And secondly, that the Patients' Rights Charter should be implemented across the country, not just in the CA states, but even in other states. And at the same, in parallel, a body called the Veterans Forum has also filed a PL in the Supreme Court. They have a somewhat similar plea, but mostly their focus is on regulation of rates. Now, these two PLs are being heard, and last year we had a few hearings, substantive hearings of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court asked the central government and the health ministry that you need to now develop a framework for standardization of private hospital rates. Otherwise, we will consider imposing CGHS rates on private hospitals. And suddenly, so there was no action on CA by either the government, no substantive action, or even by the private sector. But suddenly, the private sector lobby woke up after this hearing in March last year. And after that, 5 interventions, and actually not interventions, but 5 petitions have been filed in the Supreme Court, all by private medical associations or private hospital associations, saying the government has no mandate to regulate the rates of private hospitals, which means that the act and the rules itself are being challenged. An act and rules which have been adopted by the parliament are being challenged by a powerful commercial lobby. So we need to really do something, and a bit urgently now, because you can imagine that, and the topmost lawyers of this country, you know, the kind of lawyers, some of the lawyers, you know, high profile corporate lawyers, they have stood in the court to argue this against regulation of private hospitals, against regulation of rates. So this is the kind of situation which is unfolding now, and we need to do something about this. And behind this, I just also like to point out that behind the corporate hospitals, there is another very powerful hidden influencer. And that is foreign capital, foreign investments, private equity investments, venture capital, and what is known as developmental finance, institutions. They are pouring in money into the Indian private corporate hospital sector because it's so lucrative. It's one of the most profitable businesses. So between 2001 to 2013, in roughly little more than 10 years, private foreign investment in the hospital sector in India grew by more than 100 times, more than 100-fold. And this is the fueling corporatization of healthcare. And corporatization of healthcare is an extreme form of commercialization, where the entire and overwhelming dynamic of the hospital is to extract maximum revenue and maximize returns for the stakeholders and the investors and the patients and the doctors and the staff. Their interests become completely secondary. So this is a very, very, worrisome trend. And these large corporate hospital chains are now actually pushing out of the market smaller hospitals, charitable hospitals. They're either being taken over or they're being pushed out. Instead of that, we're coming up with this kind of corporatization of healthcare. There we have some studies on this, which I can also. So do keep in mind that what the corporate hospitals are doing, behind them, there is an even larger set of financial actors. And these are, which are globalized in nature. So हम मेक इन इंडिया की बात करते हैं, हम देशभक्त भी हैं, हम सारे लोग, पर हमारी देशभक्ति इस बात की तरफ नहीं जाती है कि हमारे ये जो बड़े बड़े कॉर्पोरेट हॉस्पिटल चेन्स है ना, इनको विदेशी कंपनियों ने टेक ओवर कर लिया है. अपोलो, मैक्स, फोर्टिस, मेदांता, Manipal, all these big corporate hospital chains are no longer under control of Indian companies. They have actually been largely taken over, or significantly their stakes have been taken over by foreign investments, foreign investing firms and private equity firms. So this is actually the trend which is going on, which is pushing this commercialization of healthcare. Okay, so what can we do about this? Of course, it's a very serious situation, but I'll just like to share with you a couple of examples of what has been done in the recent past by Swasthya Abhiyan, and also at least one other example. So during COVID, across the India and also across the world, in India and also in Maharashtra, there's a lot of overcharging by private hospitals. And in Maharashtra, in 2021, which is during the second wave, we organized a public hearing on on private hospitals. It's probably the first public hearing on private hospitals. And about 130 people joined, like, hybrid mode. And one after the other, people presented their testimonies of gross overcharging. And we recorded 23 of these testimonies in this book called Patients' Voices During the Pandemic, which is available on Sathi's website if you're interested. And some of the stories are extremely shocking. Uh, I don't want to, go into details, but you can imagine the kind of overcharging which took place. And then we did a small survey. It's not, not a small survey, a reasonably large survey of 2,579 COVID patients across Maharashtra, 34 districts of Maharashtra, and found that 75% of them had been overcharged compared to the government rates. And the scale of overcharging was roughly triple of the government mandated rates. So the government mandated rate for an ICU bed was 7,500 rupees per day, which is also pretty high. And the actual amount that people paid was above 21,000 rupees per day, roughly triple. So this was the kind of background in which then a social mobilization emerged in Maharashtra. And then basically we approached the health minister of Maharashtra. We had a meeting with the health minister of Maharashtra, and we told him that you have to conduct an audit of these overcharged bills. And people who have been overcharged by private hospitals, they should be refunded the amounts that have been overcharged. And then this audit took place. Nearly 500 bills were audited. And in 63 cases, people received substantial refunds from private hospitals. The total amount going above 16 lakh rupees. And in most cases, above 25,000 rupees. You can see some of the checks and one of the doctors refunding from a private hospital, refunding the amount to the patient. So this is possible. If there is a certain kind of mobilization, people are organized. Of course, it was not simple at all, because analyzing those bills was a nightmare. Proving that those bills were overcharged was also a huge task. But we managed to do this in a large number of cases. And besides these 63, another 100 cases roughly received informal refunds from the hospital, because the hospital called people and told them that, okay, we'll settle with you or whatever. So this kind of social accountability, even of private hospitals, is possible. After COVID, in Maharashtra, we have continued this campaign in the form of demanding that the Maharashtra Nursing Home Registration Act, which has adopted certain rules in 2021, which says that every hospital must display its rates. Every hospital, private hospital, must display the patient's rights charter, and there should be grievance redressal cells in every district and every city. So as a result of this campaign, in at least 3-4 cities, now hospitals have started. You can see one of the pictures of the hospital rate card. Significant number of hospitals have started displaying their rates. This is not difficult. If you go to a restaurant, the first thing you see is the menu card. If you go to a shop, the first thing you ask for is the rates. So why should not at least indicative basic rates? We call it a free market. So the first principle of the free market is transparency of information. So why should not hospitals display their basic indicative rates and make it available to patients? It is there in the Patient's Rights Charter. It's there in the Clinical Establishment Act rules. It's there in the MNHRA rules. It's there in the rules of half a dozen other states across the country. But why is there so far not enough demand from society to say that you have to display these rates? So it is possible if there is this kind of mobilization. I'll also add one more example from the government. And this is from West Bengal. Now in West Bengal, something interesting has happened about regulation of private hospitals. While there are laws in many states, and there's a central CA, as we know, those laws have not led to much impact. In West Bengal, they modified their West Bengal Clinical Establishments Act in 2017. And they did one more thing. They formed a Clinical Establishments Regulatory Commission. And this regulatory commission has 40 full-time skilled staff. It has a building of its own. It has powers to inspect any private hospital. And it has powers to summon any hospital and hold hearings regarding complaints. So I have visited this, and we have had detailed discussions, and we also talked to patients groups in West Bengal. And this commission has dealt with more than 1,600 patient complaints until now, mostly relating to overcharging. And in hundreds of cases, they have actually awarded, a refund or some kind of compensation to the patients because they had been overcharged by a private hospital. All these judgments are there on their website. and the hearing is held within 15 days, and the judgment is given within 1 month of the complaint. So it's a very time-bound process. So these things are possible, and the hearings take place on a regular basis. So if there is a will in the government to deal with this, arbitrariness of private hospitals and to deal with the complaints and grievances of patients, such mechanisms and probably even better mechanisms could be set up in every state across the country. And this is something that we should ask for. So I'll conclude now, because I think it will be good to have more detailed discussion with basically what is now we are planning as Jan Swasthya Abhiyan. So as you know, the coming 7th April, which is just about a week from now, is the World Health Day. So on World Health Day, we are launching a national opinion poll, which has 5 simple questions about people's experiences in private hospitals and what they feel needs to be done about regulation of private hospitals. So for example, have you experienced seemingly, unnecessary procedures or unnecessary medication in a private hospital? Did you see the rates displayed, or were the rates provided to you the last time you visited a private hospital? Do you think that the government should regulate rates in private hospitals? Do you think that the government should ensure that the Patients' Rights Charter is implemented? So these are the kind of very simple, basic questions. We are launching this poll. I would encourage all of you to see this poll and to widely circulate it and encourage everybody in your network to respond to this poll. We want to collect thousands of responses so that we know what do people think. And once we know that, then we will compile those results at the state level and at the national level and release it in the media and also provide it to the Honorable Supreme Court that, okay, some hospitals are saying rates should not be regulated. What are people saying? Please also, understand that. And so this is part of the next phase campaign on patients' rights besides the PL. So I would suggest that any of you who is interested, first of all, please see the Patients' Rights Charter. It's there. I'm not very prominently displayed, but it's there on the clinical establishments, National Council website. See the Patients' Rights Charter, and I can, of course, share the link with you. Read it and circulate the Patients' Rights Charter, including maybe the posters, which are in a much more simpler form widely. We have published as Jan Swasthya Abhiyan frequently asked questions, 12 questions and answers on Clinical Establishments Act and the Patients' Rights Charter. You're welcome to read that and also circulate that widely. It's written in simple language. It's there in Hindi also. आप हिंदी में भी उसको पढ़ सकते हैं, अपने साथियों के साथ में साझा कर सकते हैं, शेयर कर सकते हैं. And do consider organizing meetings on this issue. We need to create very large-scale public awareness. As I said, such an important set of regulations unimplemented for last 15 years, it's unacceptable. And it's there in the Supreme Court now. At least we have some chance that, some action might be taken. And write to the Union Health Ministry, and also, do consider, if you are a consumer group or any kind of social rights group, to file a supportive intervention in RPL. Just a simple intervention also will definitely help. Already some such consumer groups are filing such an intervention. They're in the process of doing that. So do support this cause, and I'll be very happy to provide any further information, and let's have the discussion now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shukla. It was a very, very passionate and comprehensive coverage about what are the basic hurdles we have faced in regulation and what are the possibilities. It is what we are pitted against is not just a commercial medical lobby in India, but with vested interests driven by foreign capital too. So we have uh, an insurmountable task, but at the same time, the kind of mobilization organizations like Jan Swasthya Abhiyan are engaged in give us hope. And you already given us a model of the West Bengal Regulatory Commission, which is doing such work. It is not, and that there is hope that with state intervention, we can have regulation. And of course, it is very chilling to know that these costs are driving almost 6 crore people into poverty every year. This is a very, very serious scenario in this sense. And
That's
we don't
equal
know
to the
where it will end.
population of Germany or
Almost, yes. 15 years,
uh,
90 crores is almost as big as the population. So that is a chilling fact.
yeah.
And we are indeed very enthused by the kind of anger assemblies and the kind of work which is being done. Of course, about the 7th April and your endeavor, we will, and our friends, we will try to do whatever we can in spreading the message around. There are right now several questions which I will read out. First is by Mr. Bhulchand. He has said that, of course, there are a few people like Mr. Roy who have said that they know you and that you're a very eminent personality, and they're thankful for this webinar. The first question is, please outline effective methods to push and implement laws essential for welfare of general public, and if possible through legal means. We are aware of the limitations of government-run services. That is
Okay.
one.
Yeah, there are, I think, three questions perhaps, or four questions from the same person probably, or are these from different
No,
people?
no, they are separate. They are from
Acha,
us.
okay.
The first one is from.
Okay. So, of course, that's a little generic question. I mean, methods to implement laws for welfare of the general public. So, I'll just put in two or three sort of key components of an effective public welfare system. And we have both examples of failed systems and also some examples of effective systems in India. So the one key component is adequate budgets. So if a welfare scheme or a welfare measure is not accompanied by an adequate budget, it's not going to work. As long as the budget is there, it does work to some reasonable extent. And the second is social accountability mechanisms, which empower people to demand their entitlements, effectively on the ground. If you see NREGA, for example, during the period roughly, 2007, 8 or whatever until roughly 2014, when it was well funded and also social audits were going on a large scale, it benefited tens of crores of, rural workers across the country. It was a less celebrated story, but it was a very important story. So adequate funds and social accountability mechanisms are two very important components. Otherwise, laws just made on paper, they don't go very far. So yeah, and third is, of course, if it's a regulatory act, then there has to be adequate infrastructure and human power to implement that regulation. So the WCERC example is actually shows that if you put in place a dedicated mechanism for regulation, then they'll work full time and ensure that it happens. If there's an already overworked district health officer or CMHO or whatever who is doing 25 other things, and then you give them a 26th responsibility, regulate all the hospitals in your district, private hospitals in your district, it's not going to work. You have to have dedicated human power for that. There are other questions which are little like, I think, not so related to my topic, like about artificial intelligence and
Yes, sir.
telemedicine.
We're
So
leveraging technology and
yeah,
yes.
so I mean, obviously, this is not my topic for today.
Okay.
So
We'll
I
move on to
think,
the next one. So
yeah,
do
I
you
think if
don't
there's time in the end, we can address it.
I
But
will see that the
yeah,
next one I'll read out is
uh,
don't you think that the state should focus on preventive health care,
hmm,
which would mean avoiding expenditure on medicine by having better hygiene and health practices in place? For example, government school toilets that can lead to UTI.
yeah. So this is, of course, absolutely correct that preventive healthcare is very important. But I'd like to add, it's not an either or situation. And in a country like India, both are urgently and very effectively required. So we require preventive health services, of course, clean water, sanitation, nutrition, environmental hygiene, and so on. And these need to be done through a somewhat intersectoral approach. The health department alone cannot do these. Other departments need to be involved. And there are some examples of how this can be done. You see, I mean, if you're interested, we can discuss that. Uh, but along with that, today people are on a daily basis falling ill. And they're falling into poverty because they're falling ill. And because they're falling into poverty, there are other social determinants, like their ability to eat nutritious food or their ability to stay in a clean and sanitary kind of environment is also getting compromised. So we have to put a stop there also. So we have to work on the social determinants, and we also have to work on ensuring at least basic, good quality, adequate free healthcare. Both together are required. So that's just my quick take about that. Let's not make it into an either or issue. कि नहीं नहीं सरकार का इलाज करना तो काम ही नहीं है सरकार को तो खाली प्रिवेंटिव केयर देना चाहिए. दैट इज नॉट एन एक्सेप्टेबल आर्ग्यूमेंट. नो सॉरी. Both things have to be done by the government. Then only this problem can be effectively tackled. This is actually an argument which is given by some friends in the private sector कि ये सब हॉस्पिटल चलाने का काम नहीं हमारे ऊपर छोड़ दीजिए, जहाँ पैसा बनता है, जो कमर्शियली लुक्रेटिव है, और आप ना इम्यूनाइजेशन देते रहिए, लोगों को कुछ सफाई वफाई के बारे में बताते रहिए, पैसा बनाने का काम हम करेंगे, और ये सब जो ग्राउंड लेवल का जो सॉर्ट ऑफ लेस ग्लैमरस काम है वो सरकार करेगी. ऐसा नहीं है. Even you look at AIMS, for example. I'm a graduate and postgraduate of AIMS in Delhi. And AIMS is one of the best hospitals in this country still. And it was definitely when I graduated from there a few decades back. So it gives an example of how a well-functioning public institution in the health sector can function, despite many constraints. It's overloaded, it's crowded, and so on. But still, it's delivering quality care. Imagine if we had no public hospitals in this country, what the situation will be of the private sector. It would just completely overrun. So anyway, so there's another question about, can we expect the Supreme Court to take a hard line on regulation of private healthcare?
So there is one related question. What is this, of course, what you're reading out? Can we expect the Supreme Court to take a hard line on regulation of private healthcare? This is in the context of excessive faith of what the market can deliver. Also, Mr. Sharad Bansali, he wants to know what is the current status of the PIL in the Supreme Court. He, of course, before that, he has said that your presentation lucidly brings out the fact that privatization without effective regulation is a sure recipe for disaster. Appreciate your selfless efforts, and he wants to know the current status along with the question.
Okay. So, yeah, and there's another question about the Supreme Court. So, well, first of all, let me share that we do not have just a kind of blind faith in the Supreme Court. With all due respect, I think all of us are aware of the current situation in our country today. But we have to fight to reclaim these institutions also, with all their limitations. And we have to, through public intervention, through public mobilization, and through public awareness building, we have to make sure that the issue becomes so visible that even courts will have to take cognizance of that. So that is our hope, that, and the law is on our side, incidentally. I mean, the law is firmly on our side. We have a law which is sitting on the statutes for the last 15 years and not getting implemented. So we should, develop as much mobilization outside the court and as strong arguments inside the court to ensure that, at least the law gets implemented, the law of this land gets implemented. So I'd say that. And what is the current status? So as I said that we had a good start. And last year in March 2024, we had an important hearing where the court told the Union Health Ministry to come up with a framework for standardization of rates. Something, incidentally, which already considerable amount of work had been done in the past, but then it all went into cold storage. So, and if the government doesn't do it, then CGHS rates will be implemented, ऐसा Supreme Court ने बोला था. After that, immediately, suddenly, पिछले 12-13 साल में, 15 साल में किसी को प्राइवेट सेक्टर के लोगों को नहीं लगा कि सीए में कुछ प्रॉब्लम है. But suddenly they realized there is a huge problem with this law. Last 15 years, there was no problem with the law. Now suddenly, when the Supreme Court said implement the law, as soon as the law started getting implemented, there was a threat of implementation. 5 major private, medical associations and hospital associations have come up with very long-winded kind of arguments that why the government should not regulate, healthcare costs. And just a word about that, हमारे देश में, across the country, insurance companies standardize healthcare costs in hospitals. We have a PMJY program, which involves 12,000 private hospitals across the country who are paid at standard rates for 1,400 different clinical procedures. So there is a rate standardization is already there on the cards. And besides that, of course, various state health insurance schemes and so on. So it is eminently technically possible to standardize rates. The government is already doing it in its own way. The point is it needs to be made universal and it needs to be made mandatory. Japan, I'll just give you an example, is a hardcore capitalist country. We probably have no confusion about that. But in Japan, by law, across the country, all hospitals have to follow a common scheme of rates by law. And secondly, by law in Japan, no private hospital is allowed to earn profits from running the hospital. Profiteering or making profits and extracting them from the hospital is not allowed by law. You can reinvest it in the hospital, If you make some surplus, you can reinvest and buy more equipment or expand your hospital or whatever, but you cannot take, profits out of the hospital by law. So this is a capitalist country like Japan. तो हम तो सोशलिस्ट हुआ करते थे. तो यहाँ सिंपल सी चीज है भाई, रेट्स को स्टैंडर्डाइज कर दो. And of course, we're not saying they should be made some unrealistically low rates, which the hospital cannot, function. They should be reasonable rates where the hospital will make some reasonable income, but it should not be exploitative. It should not be arbitrary, and it should not be based on irrational, unnecessary procedures and so on. So,
So, this with the private players entering the Supreme Court, now is there a threat to that act, CA?
I suppose so. It's not actually a threat to the act as such. It's unlikely that the act will get changed. But what can happen, and that is probably what they're counting on, is to stall the process again.
All the process.
So 5 intervention दे दिए, लंबे चौड़े, सब बहुत हाई प्रोफाइल लॉयर्स आप लोग जानते होंगे, जो टॉप कॉर्पोरेट लॉयर्स, उनको खड़ा कर दिया कोर्ट में, तो जज साहब भी थोड़े से सोचेंगे 2 बार कि अभी इसमें आगे करना है कि नहीं करना है. एंड मेक द, इफ यू कैनॉट contest the issue, then confuse the issue. ऐसा भी है. So give so many different kinds of arguments that the court also will think, oh, this is a very technical issue. So, okay, we have to stop. So I think their main strategy right now is to stall the process. But therefore, it's important to file interventions from more than one bodies. It's not GSA fighting alone. As I said, a consumer voice karke ek major consumer organization, they're now filing a supportive petition in the court. So more and more groups, at least they can file interventions if they cannot file an independent petition. We need to have citizens groups, supporting this cause.
Thank you, sir. There are next 2 questions. One relates to patent. Does ending patent protections benefit consumers? And the next one leads to... yes.
There's one other question which I missed. When one breaks down hospital costs, what aspects can be made cheaper and efficient?
Yes.
ये बहुत interesting question है. You might be knowing कि आजकल कॉर्पोरेट हॉस्पिटल में जो टोटल बिल आता है, उसमें से जो एक्चुअली स्पेशलिस्ट डॉक्टर की जो फीस होती है, that is barely 10 to 15%. In most cases, except for some celebrity specialists, उनकी बात अलग है. Otherwise, the ordinary specialist gets barely 10 to 15% of the bill. The rest all goes to the corporate hospital. Now, उसमें क्या उसका जो breakup है, there are many things which can be made cheaper. I'll just tell you a couple of them. One is medicines. Medicines which are supplied by the hospital are heavily overmarked. And we've done a study on this. We did the study during COVID where we took the medicine bills which had been given by the hospitals or by the hospital pharmacies. And we did a simple calculation कि hospital ने वो दवाई कितने में खरीदी और hospital ने वो दवाई patient को कितने में बेची. Simple. So the hospital is buying the medicine for X amount, and then they add some markup and they're selling it to the patient on Y amount. So आप क्या सोचेंगे, इसमें जो हमारे गवर्नमेंट का रेगुलेशन है वो है 16%, 16%. That should be the margin, which is a reasonable margin for a retailer, including a hospital. Can you imagine what is the margin that is being charged by hospitals when they're just selling the medicine to the patient? They're not manufacturing it. They're not doing any other. The median, the most common margins were 200% to 400%.
Right.
Which means, and this is also on consumables like IV sets, IV bottles, needles pay, up to 1000%. PP kits. So in सब चीजों पे, so 200 to 400% margin का मतलब ये है कि अगर आप 40 रुपए किलो में चीनी खरीदते हैं, तो आप 250 रुपए किलो में चीनी खरीद रहे हैं और रोज खरीद रहे हैं और आराम से बिना पूछे उसके बारे में कुछ भी, because you don't know that you're being so heavily overcharged. And there is this scam of the MRP. So there's a printed MRP which is heavily inflated. But we cannot question it, as an ordinary consumer, because it's chapa hua hai na. And then in that, actually the hospital is given a huge discount compared to that MRP, and then the hospital claims the difference as its profit, which is very, very high. So this is one example of what can be reduced. And secondly, obviously, many of the bed charges, other hospital charges are also quite inflated, and they can be brought down, which will benefit patients a lot. Okay.
Next one relates to patents. Does ending patent protection benefit consumers?
Well, yes, it can potentially. I think that's your question, Madhuji. So or you have put it in the box.
Within
Okay,
I put it because
okay, okay. So
Pratyush, our
okay,
team member Pratyush posted.
okay. So this is a big topic, and probably not centrally part of today's topic, but it's correct that there are a whole range of medicines which are under patent, and in the period that they're under patent, their prices can be heavily inflated. But the government does have certain mechanisms like compulsory licensing and certain other mechanisms under which they can ensure that the same medicine can be manufactured in our country by other manufacturers at much lower cost. So in medical emergencies and certain situations, governments can exercise that option. They don't do it usually, but it can be done. So yes, patent protections need to be balanced, or rather they have to be kept, the rational price of the same medicine needs to be kept in mind so that this excessive profiteering due to patents can be, avoided. There are many examples of that, which also we can discuss. There's a question about medical insurance.
Yes. Does medical insurance lead to protection of the charging practices of private hospitals more than protecting patient interests? What it may say,
Yeah.
does it medical insurance lead to overcharging? Does
Hmm.
it reinforce the overcharging practice of private
Yeah,
hospitals?
this is a big irony and tragedy of history. Insurance was supposed to be a protective mechanism. It was supposed to be a collective protective mechanism. And that is actually the concept behind, especially social insurance, social health insurance. But हमारे देश में social health insurance बहुत कम है, commercial insurance ज़्यादा है. And commercial insurance adds a layer of profiteering besides the profiteering by the private hospital itself. Now you have one more commercial actor in the picture, जिसको उसमें अपना margin निकालना है. So then what happens is you are setting two commercial bodies a little bit against each other, but then they also collude with each other because neither of them is actually in patient's interest. Neither of them is interested in the patient's interest. So then the private hospital and the insurance company, they bargain a little bit with each other. Insurance company बोलती है ठीक है तुम थोड़ा सा अपना बढ़ा दो, हम भी अपना प्रीमियम बढ़ा देंगे. And the gravy train will keep running and the patient will ultimately pay for it. And many things will get excluded, many things will not be covered, many claims will be rejected, or they'll be only partly fulfilled. And so ultimately what will happen is that the patient will end up paying both the premium probably and also out of pocket significant amount of expenses. It's not a very optimal solution. Commercial insurance is not an optimal solution. No country in the world has achieved universal health care through commercial insurance. This is an important point, including the United States of America, which is a very bad model based on commercial insurance. So it's a big topic, but what we need is universal health care and not, just this kind of insurance. So hospitals often use that as a pretext to overcharge. When they see that you have insurance, then they start inflating the bill कि आपको तो जेब से देना नहीं है, तो हम आपका बिल जो है और inflate कर देंगे.
So this is related to what you said about the absence of public demand for regulation. How can one explain this absence of public demand for regulation, and why is it not a poll issue in India?
Yeah.
Especially when almost the entire population is being drawn into
Yeah.
poverty.
Yeah. So, first of all, see, regulation in itself is a little difficult to probably understand for an ordinary person. Regulation ये कुछ सरकार का काम है, सरकार और hospitals देख लेंगे. I mean, it's probably difficult to make regulation itself into a popular issue. What we need to do is to translate it into patients' rights and health rights. So unless that linkage is made, people will not be able to appreciate. So what is our rights? Our rights are to standardize rates in the hospital, display of rates in the hospital, stopping of irrational procedures, ensuring that quality of care is there, etc. So जब हम इसको regulation को rights के form में प्रस्तुत करेंगे, तो इसको शायद लोग इससे relate कर पाएंगे. ये हमारा मानना है. But that needs to be taken up by political parties for it to become a poll issue. In
Someone
Maharashtra,
make,
we talked to all the political parties and said कि भाई इसको आप अपने agenda में कहीं तो लीजिए. But including the opposition parties, none of the parties seem to be particularly interested. पता नहीं private sector lobby के हाथ कहाँ तक पहुंचे हुए हैं.
manifesto be correct कर रहे हो.
हाँ. But yeah, it's a correct point. It should be put on the political agenda, but probably we'll need to do a little more work and find ways. At least one political party should take it up as a major agenda, जैसे थाईलैंड में हुआ. So you might be knowing in 2002, one political party which was not in power, they made universal health coverage their main political plank. And Thaksin, जिसका नाम शायद आपने सुना हो,
Yes.
he was the candidate. He made that universal healthcare his agenda, and he was elected with a thumping majority. And that's how the Thai universal health coverage system came into place. It's a very interesting story, and it's an example for India, and
Yes.
not a very difficult example for us to follow.
So
Hmm.
the next question is about, do legal implications lead doctors to taking the route of recommending every test to rule out everything to save themselves from being held culpable? This is
Yeah, this is, well, it's partly true, but I think that often this is also used as a pretext. Um, so if a doctor is proceeding logically and is following standard protocols, they don't have much to worry about. Of course, in some cases, the outcome for the patient may not be favorable. ऐसा होता है. The human body is unpredictable. There are medical complications which are not always predictable. So in maybe out of 1 out of 20 cases or 1 out of 50 cases, even though the doctor follows rational protocols, the patient may not recover or something. But if the doctor can show that I followed a rational procedure, then they have nothing to fear in the court of law. So just because some rare patient may sue you or may file a complaint in the consumer court, that doesn't mean you start doing unnecessary tests on every patient. That is not logical. It's not at all justified. So that's why we need standard protocols. So standard protocols अगर होंगे ना, and सरकार उनको अगर endorse करेगी, तो डॉक्टर कोर्ट पे खड़े होकर कह सकते हैं मैंने स्टैंडर्ड प्रोटोकॉल के हिसाब से ट्रीटमेंट दिया है, so I have done the right thing. They have nothing to fear. So actually standard protocols help doctors. In the United Kingdom, they have an NHS system, and they have an entire institute called NICE, N-I-C-E, National Institute for Clinical Excellence, which just does one thing. It's all doctors, public doctors, who develop and update the protocols all the time and communicate these to all the doctors. So that doctors know कि भाई cesarean कब करना है, कब नहीं करना है, angioplasty कब करनी है, कब नहीं करनी है, MRI के क्या indications हैं और क्या नहीं है. And then they follow those protocols so that at least a lot of unnecessary procedures get eliminated. So yeah, I think standard protocols are the answer to this kind of arbitrary type of unnecessary, medical procedures.
that brings us to the last question, sir. It's a more on the free market dynamics. Why doesn't free market dynamics help with lowering of healthcare costs? What makes healthcare an exception to this rule?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. A good question. So healthcare is very, very prone to something called market failure. So some kinds of goods and services, if they're left to the market, then the supply demand kind of balance and competition kind of to some extent ensures that both sides of both kinds of players, they do not there's some kind of rough equilibrium that is established. So if you want to buy a mobile phone or a pair of shoes or a two-wheeler, so you have some reasonable amount of knowledge about that product, and you have some choice and some freedom to select, and then you go in the market and you select what you want, and the sellers also have to sort of compete with each other to keep the prices at some reasonable level. In healthcare, this situation completely breaks down because of 2 or 3 reasons. First of all, there is huge knowledge asymmetry. You do not decide what medicine you're going to take for your illness. It's the doctor who decides. You are paying for it, but your doctor is deciding on your behalf. You do not decide when you want to get a surgery done or not. I mean, broadly speaking, it's the doctor who actually decides कि आपको और takes the decision on your behalf कि नहीं अभी आपको ये operation कराना है. So because of this knowledge asymmetry, which is linked with the power asymmetry, there is huge scope for what is called supplier-induced demand, which distorts the market. So this is not a normal market कि मुझे जब मन होगा तब मैं खरीदूंगा, नहीं मन होगा तो नहीं खरीदूंगा, और जो मन होगा वही खरीदूंगा. ये नहीं चल रहा है, मेडिसिन में नहीं होता है. कोई और तय कर रहा है कि आपको क्या खरीदना है और कब खरीदना है. And the second, which is linked to that, is extreme vulnerability of the patient in the healthcare situation. If you have an accident or some of your family member is critically ill, you're going go to a hospital, you don't have the time and space to bargain. कि नहीं नहीं मुझे ऐसा लगता है मुझे वैसा लगता है. The hospital is in a much more powerful position and you're in a very vulnerable position. You'll say आप सब कुछ भी करिए ना मेरे patient को बचा लीजिए. And that can be, obviously, that vulnerability can be exploited. So market does not work adequately there. And the third reason is कि मार्केट नॉन ट्रांसपेरेंसी इतनी हेल्थ केयर में. बाकी सब चीजों के दाम तो आप अमेजन पे जाइए या इंटरनेट पे जाइए, आपको पता चल जाएगा. हेल्थ केयर के रेट्स कहाँ पता चलते हैं? इट्स अ कंप्लीटली नॉन ट्रांसपेरेंट काइंड ऑफ मार्केट. सो पीपल डोंट हैव दैट काइंड ऑफ चॉइस. And they also often cannot decide when they want to get healthcare. Healthcare decides when it wants to get you. You don't decide when you want to get healthcare in many situations. So you don't have those free options in the healthcare kind of situation. So healthcare is prone to market failure. It's been recognized for the last 50, 60 years by leading economists in capitalist countries. And therefore, healthcare has to be substantially removed from the market and brought under public supervision, guidance, and provisioning. That doesn't mean that everybody has to only go to a public hospital. Private hospitals have a role to play, but there has to be a strong oversight. And the correction of market failure is through regulation. Regulation and accountability are the tools that we have to correct market failure in healthcare. Okay, so
thank you so much, sir. That
yeah.
Brings us to the end of this question and answer session. And I think you're being hands-on on the ground, and your activism, your commitment, and passion for helping people in your domain. I mean, that comes out in what you say and what you speak. There are a lot of people who have given Mani Palvesin, Anekdhara Reddy, Badrinaran here from our team. They've all found the talk very informative and a brilliant presentation. So we are much richer of this, and we
So
will.
can I conclude with this appeal?
Yes,
That on 7th of
please,
April,
please.
which is World Health Day, we will be launching this national opinion poll. So what I can do is I can share it with the Anekdhara organizers.
Yes.
And you can please, disseminate it to whatever participants who
To
might
all our
have been,
channels, we'll do it.
yeah, so that,
And also,
uh,
we want the permission for putting your presentation on our website.
yeah, sure. I'll edit it a little bit and give it to you if you want to
Yes,
put up that.
whenever it is ready,
Because,
you can send it within a week after
yeah,
that. Period.
I'll send it within a few days.
And
Yeah,
so
okay.
that brings us, my friends, to the end of a very edifying and illuminating discussion on why private healthcare should be regulated and why it is so important for us. And thank you, sir. More power to you and your team, which is doing such phenomenal work on the ground. And maybe you'll succeed in putting this demand for regulation in the manifestos of some of the national parties. And like in the US, it becomes
Yeah,
an electoral issue here.
yeah.
And I want to thank all the participants and for logging in and being with us and posing such interesting questions to bring out all the dimensions of the theme. I want to thank my team, especially Mr. Sadiq and others who are handling the website, and our special thank you to Pratyush, who's handled the live streaming, and Nayantara, who's done the poster, and the entire rest of the team. Thank you so much. Just a small information. On 27th of April, our next webinar will be on the changing values of Indian journalism. We'll be out with the poster in a couple of weeks. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
It was a privilege,
Thanks a lot.
really, and an honor. Thank you so much.
Thanks to your entire team. Please,
Thank you, sir.
and great that you're running this kind of a program on such a regular basis. It's a very
Thank
useful
you so much.
activity.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thanks. Bye then.
Okay, live stream has ended.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Pratyush.